Hi, it's Dave. Welcome. Today I'm joined by Will Summerlin and Frank Downing from ARK Invest. They are analysts. Will Summerlin is their AI analyst focusing on AI technologies, and Frank Downing is their analyst focusing on crypto and cloud computing. I want to welcome Will back on the show, and for the first time, Frank, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Awesome.
Good to be back.
Yeah. I tell you guys, I love chatting with you guys, especially from ARK Invest. Brett, Yassine, even former James Wong. You guys just I feel like you guys resonate with a lot of people out there who really are passionate about technology and innovation and what's going on, in the real world, not being distracted by kind of noise of financial news, ups and downs. So I want to dive into Tesla AI Day. So first question is, Autonomy Day 2019, 2020 Battery Day versus 2021 Tesla AI Day. Which of those 3 days was your favorite? Let's go for Will first.
I mean, I'm very much biased here in that I'm an AI nerd, but this was definitely the biggest day for me.
Cool.
I think looking at the progress they've made over the last couple of years is really quite incredible, and kind of digging in and looking under the hood and trying to understand the AI stack, the hardware stack, the software stack that's actually powering this was really interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And Frank, how about you?
Yeah, I would say for me, I like 2019 because I think you kind of saw the vision unfolding of Tesla owning the software and the hardware stack with the full self-driving computer in the car. But 2021 was cool because you saw that vision kind of start to come to fruition with Dojo and kind of the outline of their entire kind of AI training side outside of the car. So I like both. I like the start of the story, and then I like the vision coming together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. Will, you pointed out Tesla showing the progress, and it's only been 2 years, right? But yet they've progressed so much. Can you give us some ideas of what that progress is looking like? Is it impressive or not for people kind of observing?
Yeah, I think it's very impressive. I mean, if you look at this, subjectively, you can go on YouTube and watch videos of sort of the early versions of autopilot, earlier versions of FSD, and then look at it now. There's a YouTuber, I think it's Holmar's Catalog, who posts great content on just sort of FSD drives, and you can literally see the progress that it's making. And I think that's in a large part because of the fleet size. And if you think about sort of self-driving, it's really fundamentally a data problem. You need huge volumes of training data, you can get 99% of the way with not a huge amount of data, but getting that last 1% requires so much data. And Tesla has just been collecting data off of their fleet of vehicles. And so, when we think about this sort of from an evolutionary perspective, there's all the technical advancements which we can dive into, but really it's just the data acquisition over the last 2 years has been incredible. And that's allowed them to build a fundamentally better system. And if you look at, some of the things that they covered during AI Day, the move from sort of the image space to vector space for predictions was huge. Most companies that deal with computer vision, they operate in image space, which is looking at sort of a two-dimensional picture and doing, object recognition and things like that. But to do something in the real world, like self-driving, it really benefits you to be in vector space. And that's easier said than done. It's a really hard thing to do. In order to get there, they had to overcome, a lot of pretty high bar technical challenges. And we saw that with the camera fusion, fusing the data before versus after. We saw that with the spatial RNNs. We saw that with a lot of the sort of under the hood technical improvements. But I mean, subjectively, you can see the progress. If you have a Tesla, I'm sure you've observed it. If you don't have a Tesla, you can go on YouTube and take a look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's awesome. This whole thing of going from image 2D space into this 3D vector space. 2 years ago at Autonomy Day, Andrej Karpathy showed this sample or example of how vision could be used to reconstruct 3D scene. And it's crazy because 2 years later, they're following through. It's not like this pipe dream. They're just saying, oh, this is hypothetically possible, but they're actually taking the next steps and creating that 3D vector space, and it's becoming basically the foundation of a lot of their vision and driving system. Any kind of thoughts on that there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the team probably underestimated how hard it was going to be to make this transition happen. And they talked about it a little bit. You could hear them sort of diving into some specific problem sets they had to overcome. And I think this is just a really pure technical execution play over the last couple of years. It's just hitting a problem, overcoming it, hitting a problem, overcoming it. And I think it required them to redesign more parts of the system than I think they expected. Camera fusion is a great example. If you're trying to do predictions in vector space, it doesn't work very well if you're trying to fuse all your detections, after or if you're doing the detections after you fuse the images or before you fuse the images. Whereas if you're doing it after you fuse the images, you can get much better predictions in vector space. But that required this sort of image fusion problem to be solved. And so it's just it was like everywhere they turned, there was another problem to overcome. And I think that they have overcome many of those problems, which is great to see. And it's starting to pay dividends. I mean, if you look at the distance predictions, prior to sort of the vector space transition, that's why radar was there. It wasn't that good. And if you look at it now, they had a chart during AI Day that sort of showed, distance projections or depth projections of radar versus sort of the vision system operating in vector space. In vector space, vision system is literally right on top of radar predictions. And so, I think that's one example of many of the benefits you get from this transition. But no doubt it was technically very difficult.
Yeah. Frank, I want to ask you like this concept of the bigger picture. When you take a step back on Tesla AI Day, like what is the key thing you think Tesla is showing off? Like what's your key takeaway from this? And does this change the story of Tesla, in the bigger picture at all?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like almost like an Apple-like strategy of owning the software and the hardware all the way through so that they can control their own destiny. They're solving all these problems from the vision side to the planning side to the actual inference in the car and the training in the data center. And to do the training, they need the proper labeling. So they have their auto labeling pipeline. They want to own the full stack. And so they're not going to be, held up by other parts of the supply chain that they're waiting for the next chip to come out. They now are making their own inference and training chips. For me, it's really them owning every step of that process that I think helps them stand out and helps them differentiate.
Like at Tesla AI Day, were there any parts of that process? Like, so they laid out, their whole vision and planning, their training system, their hardware, execution, all this stuff. Like, was there any parts that you thought was like, wow, I didn't know that, or I'm impressed, especially by that, part of the big stack?
Yeah, I loved the part talking about adding memory into the models to handle situations of occlusion, where if you just have a camera system and a biker goes behind a car, if you're just looking at the camera, you're going to forget that bike is there. But if you have memory in your models, you can remember that bike was there and still predict where that bike is going, even though there's a car obfuscating it. Or when you have a single out, and this is part of the 3D vector space planning as well, but if you have a car that spans multiple frames, they showed how poor the prediction was before when that object was in multiple camera frames, and how moving to vector space and the 3D planning, you can actually maintain a consistent sense of where that vehicle is in the vector space where you couldn't have just from the image space. Some of those comparisons of the before and after I thought were really impressive.
Awesome. Regarding Dojo, the chip itself, like, do you have any, like, can you give like in a layman's kind of people watching, like, explanation of how impressive or different, this kind of chip architecture is, and what will this enable Tesla to do?
Yeah, so Dojo is built around the D1 chip, which is their single unit of compute. You could compare it to a GPU, although it's an application-specific chip. So Tesla took everything they need from the instruction set to the amount of compute and the amount of bandwidth, and they built a chip specifically for that without any legacy support or anything else that you might have in a GPU that's more general purpose, to build something specific for AI training in the way that they need to do it. And I think if you just look at the numbers, they're not like out of this world insane. The teraflops of compute are slightly better than NVIDIA's A100. And the bandwidth is significantly higher, but I don't think it's anything that NVIDIA couldn't do or somebody else couldn't do. But what Tesla did is put it all together in one package and make sure it scales to the supercompute level that they need. And I think that's what is important. They built the chip that they needed. Somebody else could replicate it. It'd be very expensive to do the same thing, but Tesla built the chip they needed, and that's going to enable them to continue innovating and reduce the time to train and the cost to train as well.
Yeah, yeah. I want to toss out this kind of idea to both of you guys. So, Elon talked about this whole the time to iterate, right? Like one iteration.
Yep.
If they could just reduce that time by a little bit, that's significant over many iterations. And then, Frank, you talk about this whole idea of integrating software and hardware, the whole Apple approach. And when I look at some of this stuff, it's like Tesla isn't relying really much on third party technology or software or relationships too. Like it's not partnerships with all these companies to get the data, to get some type of architecture, get different things, or even a separate hardware OEM supplier to put on the cars. It's all integrated like so tightly, it seems like, and they're like so focused on building it from scratch themselves. Can you give your kind of reactions to like how will that help Tesla or hurt Tesla? Like, because it must be a massive, ambitious enterprise or effort to actually manage all this stuff, but is it worth it? And will it help them to get some type of intangible advantage over, anyone else out there?
Yeah, I think, and you kind of saw this. It's almost like a cultural thing. In the question at the very end, somebody asked, "Are you interested in open sourcing any of this work that you've done?" Because, like Will mentioned, you're solving all of these different problems that haven't been solved before. Are you interested in open sourcing it? And Elon was basically like, "Not really.
Yeah.
like this is expensive to do, right? Like they're going all in on this, and they want to solve the complete picture." And I think it's a big bet, but something that they're well positioned to solve. Like they have AI Day to attract the top talent. And they're doing that for a reason, because they need it to succeed. And I think they've pretty much figured that they need to own every step of that chain to do it right. There still will be opportunity for others, but I think that's what they've decided, that they need to own it all.
Got it.
I would add to that, this only works with economies of scale. It's very hard if you're a small company to build a completely vertically integrated platform and make the numbers work. This only works if you're selling, millions of units. And that's why Apple can do it so effectively, is they have this just incredible economy of scale. And I think Tesla is in an advantage position because they also have these economies of scale. And so they're sort of unique in that sense. And like Frank said, it's really a talent thing. If you can attract better engineers than the vendors or suppliers you would work with otherwise, why wouldn't you build it yourself? And I think Tesla has been, really good at attracting brilliant people across the spectrum, whether that's a software engineer, a data scientist, a hardware designer, a battery expert. And if they can attract talent that's sort of the top of their field, that would otherwise work at Google, I think that they can build, in most cases, better components than their suppliers would build.
And I'll add one more thing that I think boosts Tesla's chance of success that our director of research, Brett, mentioned on Friday coming out of the event, was that for a lot of these, like Waymo or Mobileye to succeed, they need to nail full autonomous driving. That's the measure for success. Tesla has a wide fleet of vehicles already out there, and they're just continuing to roll out more and more autonomy, right? Greater autonomy. Full self-driving is getting better, and there's more features that get rolled out. And so that kind of gives them more of a runway to reach full autonomous as a measure of success, versus some of these other like pure play players that they're not successful unless they nail full autonomous, because they don't have that fleet of vehicles that are already out there and those sales to supplement it if they don't.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
As Google, but Waymo as a silo.
Yeah. So, this Will, your point about economies of scale, it's so, I think, fundamental in the sense that Tesla, I think Andre was saying they have 1,000 people in their labeling team, and this is not their AI team. This is just their labeling team. And it's like, you can't do that unless you have massive economies of scale. Like imagine your burn rate, right? With a 1,000 person labeling team. But I think one of the overlooked things is last quarter, Tesla had, I think it's a $2.4 billion adjusted EBITDA profit, or, like cash flow. But they're doing this while investing into this type of R&D. So it's like, I don't think many are realizing Tesla's like this cash cow, that they're investing all this stuff into R&D and to AI, and yet they're still showing, a profit. But that's only possible through this massive economies of scale of a profitable business model that's already there, and will only get stronger as they sell more cars. And is Tesla going to sell like less cars in 1 year, 2 years? Like, it's probably not likely. So, it's like, it's interesting, like dynamic there of just the whole profitable business model funding this R&D on a massive scale, but it's being overlooked, I think, a lot. Just this investment. I thought AI Day kind of started to showcase some of that. Any thoughts on kind of those issues?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's interesting if you look at, some of their competitors, the legacy auto companies. They have two fundamental problems when it comes to reinvestment. Number one is, there's an expectation that they're old world companies, they should pay a dividend. And so, the question is, are they going to continue to pay that dividend and keep their shareholders happy? Or are they going to do aggressive reinvestment like Tesla has done? Whereas Tesla started from the ground up, aggressively investing their cash flow. And so, that's one challenge. I think the second challenge is if you think about some of these legacy auto manufacturers, as this transition to EV happens, their traditional business is likely to decline, right? Their traditional, gas-powered vehicles and sales volume is likely to decline, which means they're going to have less capital to invest in an EV transition. And so you sort of have this really interesting competitive dynamic where your competitor's core business is likely to decline, but at the same time, they need to very aggressively invest in sort of a brand new technology platform from the ground up. And that's not even considering autonomy. That's just considering that the petrol or the gas to EV transition. Whereas Tesla's already in an advantage position in the sense that they've built one of the best platforms in the world when it comes to electric vehicles. It's already producing significant cash flow that they can reinvest in even the next horizon, which is autonomy. So while the legacy automakers are sort of struggling to make this transition from gas to electric happen, and struggling to decide by committee whether to pay a dividend or invest in batteries, Tesla's sort of already on the next horizon. They're taking the massive cash flow from EV and investing in autonomy. So that's certainly an advantage. And I think, culturally, those are the companies that we tend to like at ARK, or the companies that are very aggressively investing in the future.
Definitely. I want to get into kind of the heart and meat of, I think, Tesla AI Day, which is, it seems like Tesla is developing a synthetic brain in a sense, where it's like the ambitions are beyond just, cars, right? I mean, it's going further than what most people have expected. And I hear some kind of pushback from some people are like, oh my gosh, like Tesla, how can they make a robot? Isn't Boston Dynamics like way ahead of Tesla? Look at, what the Atlas can do and all the dance moves and the video, all that stuff. But when I look at it, I'm like, it seems like most of a robot is the brain, the power the ability to know how to move and coordinate, how to interact with its space around it. And I'm like, who can like compete with Tesla in the real world, especially with all their data and what they've shown in terms of what they've built up. How do you guys look at this? The relationship between robot and having the AI brain, and does Tesla already have the lead in robotics over like companies like Boston Dynamics because they have the brain, or is there some other angle that I'm missing?
I think if you look at any AI problem, you can really distill it down to two challenges. One is you need to acquire and label huge volumes of training data. And two is you need the raw compute to actually train neural nets on these massive data sets. And I think, if you think about Tesla's positioning and what they demonstrated during AI Day, they are building that compute infrastructure. And Frank, can dive into that with Dojo. So they have that half of the equation. And then from a data perspective, like you said, they already have massive volumes of data from their fleet on the road that's already being used to train their neural nets. Whether that transitions to applications outside of FSD, I think is something that we'll have to wait and see a little bit. I think we talked about this last time. It's like you can have this great training set, but the likelihood that somebody had encountered a piano on the highway is relatively low. So if you wanted a neural net to identify a piano, Tesla's data set might not be of value. But if you're trying to understand where that piano is sort of within this three-dimensional vector space, perhaps there's some knowledge transfer there. And I think the other thing on the data side that's really impressive is the labeling infrastructure and this auto labeling capability. And so, they mentioned they have 1,000 humans, working on labeling and annotation. And that in and of itself is impressive, that they've built that and they're able to actually do labeling and annotation on a sort of a four-dimensional, representation of all the images stitched together. So, they can label a traffic cone on this sort of 4D model, and then that will get projected out to all the individual images that made up that representation. And so that in and of itself is pretty cool. And you can imagine implications outside that. But then also the auto labeling capability. I think that if you want to train huge volumes of real world data, you simply can't scale it up to as many humans as you would need. And so you have to introduce automation at some point. And the auto labeling capability that they're building is super interesting in the sense that it depends on sort of this network effect where you need, the way it works essentially is, if you have cars driving through an intersection, then that data, the fused data from the sensor data from those cars will get passed up. And then if you see that across multiple vehicles crossing the intersection, you can sort of correlate those events and you can start to do auto annotations and auto labeling that in many cases could be bypass human labelers. In other cases, could be reviewed by human labelers in sort of a pre-annotated fashion. And so I think that component is really important if you want to scale AI into sort of the real world at the levels that we're thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Frank, any thoughts on kind of Boston Dynamics and versus Tesla in terms of robotics?
Yeah, I would almost take a step back and say, like, what I think Tesla's really good at doing, and Elon is simplifying things, when like making things dead simple. Like when he was talking about, like when I look at just the architecture of how they're developing AI, what a car has to do or any robot for an autonomous function is see something, decide what you want to do, and then execute on it. And that's something that works really well in a car with a vision system and a planning system and obviously steering and acceleration. And I think Elon's saying, okay, that works really well in a car. We can take those same core elements and do those in a different form as well, and have similar inputs and get the desired output based on what goal we're training for. So from like a very high level, I believe they can build that architecture. Whether the training data from a car is transferable to a human's head, I don't know how directly it is, or if the humanoid robot form is the best form versus like the Boston Dynamics dog thing that you can kick over and it doesn't fall. I get that it's very hard, and I think they have a history of tackling very hard problems. So it makes sense to try. But I also think right now it's like an interesting thing that somebody may want to go work at Tesla to try to build as a talent acquisition more than maybe a legitimate product.
Yeah.
But we'll see.
Timeline. Okay, so Tesla bought the humanoid. Like, when do if they have like a demonstration, like a prototype next year, when do you think people will actually be able to buy a first version of the Tesla bot? Like, are we talking about in the next 2 or 3 years? Or are we talking about more like 5 or 6 years or even longer? What's your guys' like, throw the dart in the wall, like guess there?
I think it's impossible to predict. I mean, we don't know how big of a priority it is, how many people are working on it. Elon's certainly aggressive with timelines. So I think when he announces something, he historically has pushed the team to deliver it very quickly. And oftentimes I think he's a little over optimistic on timelines, but I think that optimism drives the team at an accelerated pace, where if something's going to take 2 years, Elon says it'll take 6 months. The team does it in 2 years, but if it was any other organization or leader, it probably would have taken 10 years. And so, we've seen him operate at an accelerated pace in the past, but I think it's still very early for the bot concept. And I think it's TBD. where that stack ranks in terms of priorities and how long it's going to take to actually build something.
Yeah, and I would add on, I think like if there is a commercial product, you'd see it operating first in a very structured environment, like a factory that some other form of robot isn't well suited to handle, versus the general case of like, there's a robot in my house and I ask it to go get me groceries. Like if you think about that problem, is a humanoid robot the best way to solve that? Or can I already today create a grocery list on my Amazon Echo, tell it to check out, and then I get groceries to my door anyways, and I don't need a robot? Like that workflow is already partially solved, and it'll probably get more solved in the future with more rapid delivery and drones and everything like that. So, yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, but one thing is if you do Echo whatever grocery delivery, it's not delivered by a humanoid robot, so there's probably like a coolness element, telling your robot to go outside. And
I liked that the face would display useful information.
Yeah,
that was
exactly.
pretty funny.
Yeah, I mean, appearance of the robot, like compared to Boston Dynamics, it seems like Boston Dynamics is meant to like terrify you a little bit. I don't know if they're trying to like get some military contracts or something. It's just like, but it seems like the Tesla robot is more of this like soothing, like robot. And it seemed like Elon was a bit kind of cautious or conscientious of the responsibility he has, for robots to make them safe. Have you guys thought about kind of, that role? And do you think like Tesla will, kind of lead the charge in making safe robots? And is that important, you think?
Well, I think Tesla or Elon said most people will be able to outrun it and overpower it, which is good. Mm-hmm. I think Elon's been concerned about this for a while. We saw this with OpenAI, in his role in the early days of OpenAI, trying to build safe general artificial intelligence, and I think that extends to robots. Mm-hmm. I would agree with you. The Boston Dynamics robots aren't exactly comforting to watch. If you guys have seen the video of the dancing, so I would say that Elon, given his relationship with OpenAI in the past and sort of the purpose behind that, I would imagine he's trying to build a robot that will not destroy humanity. And hopefully the others that have sort of the scale and the capability to build, robots like that in the future have a similar philosophy. Otherwise, we could end up in a robot war. I would agree with you. I think they're certainly being conscientious of that as they build it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to throw out kind of something crazy here, but it's like before AI Day, like when you're talking about companies trying to solve for, let's say, artificial general intelligence, whether or not there is something like that, that's debatable. But let's say hypothetically, this massive super intelligence, before Tesla wasn't really in the conversation, right? You had Google DeepMind and other just, Google Brain, and even like Facebook Labs and other companies spending a bunch of resources. They have huge online presences, data, etc., OpenAI, etc. But after Tesla AI Day, one of the thoughts that just hit me, I'm like, wait a minute, like, isn't the Tesla bot like kind of like a possible format of an AGI, of like a super intelligent, it's not just an online thing. It's actually a physical, movable thing you could do work with, labor. And I'm thinking like, how do you see this play out? I mean, maybe you can't, maybe it's impossible to predict, but in 10 or 15 years, like, is there a possibility that Tesla could be in the lead for like, on the road to AGI, even passing Google and Facebook and OpenAI? Or are you looking at it from a different perspective at all?
I think I'm bifurcating kind of real world AI with, purely sort of digital native AI. I think they serve a different purpose, right? If you think about real world AI, which is what Tesla has built with FSD and would be building with the bot, I think in many ways that's a different problem set, right? The fundamental challenges are still the same. You need a lot of data, you need a lot of compute horsepower, but the sort of visual perception in 3 dimensions, the integration with sort of a control system so you can actually, drive a car or pick up an object. I think those are problems that seem to be more unique to kind of this real world AI. Whereas digital AI is a little bit different, right? If you want to use AI to have a conversation through GPT-3 or GPT in 10 years, I don't know, GPT-30, whatever it's called. I think that's solving a slightly different problem set. I think if you want a AI model that can review a contract, that's a different problem set. They do intersect, however, right? If you have a bot and you have sort of real world AI actually allowing that bot to move through the world and manipulate, you somehow want to communicate with it. And I think that's where sort of this crossover point is, where some of that kind of digital native AI will intersect with real world AI, is in the interface between humans and machine.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like with the Tesla bot, you want to have like at length conversations, and actually like that takes an extreme amount of expertise with AI to come up with basically like to pass the Turing test, in conversation, but not just a 1 minute or 5 minute conversation, but to actually, and now if Tesla can create a business model around that works, and fund development, then they've got this device that can be used in all scenarios of physical life and can be used to interact. And that's something that Google, OpenAI, Facebook, others, they kind of, I don't know, they don't have the device that's walking around. You have to place your Echo everywhere, but you don't have that, that robot to walk with you and do things for you. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's open field, but it seems like, the game seems to be evolving, obviously, in the AI and the hardware space, especially.
It is. And, interestingly, we're working on a model right now to sort of size the market for enterprise software in 2030. And so the thesis at a high level is, AI will improve the productivity of knowledge workers by some percentage. And so if you're an engineer at Google and you have an AI pair like OpenAI Codex, that could double your output as an engineer. And so the value of those tools are very high. And so based on kind of the preliminary projections, it seems like that will likely be the biggest value driver in AI, at least in the next 10, 15 years. So if you think about it in 2030 or 2035, and you ask the question, what form of AI is going to have the greatest sort of economic implications or financial implications, it seems like this crossover of AI and productivity and AI and enterprise software is probably going to have the biggest impact. And it seems logically that will be sort of this digital native AI, right? That's where the open AIs of the world and some of the others seem to be in an advantage position. But if you look at sort of the market sizing for autonomy, for example, or for factory robotics, or for blue collar workers who deliver UPS packages, that's also a very, very large addressable market. And so, I think they're two sort of distinct use cases. Whereas, the use case of having a bot in your home, arguably that's a huge TAM, but realistically, at least in the near term, it's unlikely that people are going to have a bot walking around their house. So in the near term, it seems like those are sort of the two big addressable markets that AI can chase. And one will probably be dominated by the open AIs of the world, and the other will probably be dominated by companies like Tesla.
Yeah, definitely interesting. Frank, I want to ask you about Dojo and Dojo as a service. So they didn't announce like a cloud service for Dojo. Do you think that that's in their plans, or is it even worth it, to create all this additional architecture for others while they're, so focused on just developing, they got their hands full, obviously, with their stuff. What's your thoughts on Dojo as a service?
Yeah, when you look at how cloud service providers evolved in general, was that Amazon had to build massive amounts of compute for very small periods of time when they had to fulfill the holiday season spikes, right? And to kind of fund that investment, they had to build the capacity, and then they figured they could rent it out when they're not using it, right? When you look at Tesla, will they have that kind of seasonality and spikes that allows them or would make them want to rent it out to others? Probably not, but maybe. If you look past that, one of the things that we think of is that the The AI training supercomputer is necessary because you're processing massive amounts of data. And when you're doing that, it makes most sense to have the data as close to that supercomputer as possible because the bandwidth costs are so high. So if you try to take an AI training supercomputer and move it to the cloud, anybody who doesn't have their data stored right next to that computer is going to have massive costs involved in running those models. So it makes it harder and less economical to do. That being said, they might do it, but I view it as less likely than more.
Okay, got it. The future of Dojo, is it just more expanding to meet the demands of their compute kind of training needs? Is there anything they can learn from that might apply to their future, like in-car hardware? Like, for example, hardware 4, hardware 5, that might be more innovative or different because of what they've learned on the training compute side?
Yeah, they might. I think just generally building expertise around silicon design, they're scaling it up massively to go just from inference to also training. And I think you see from cooling, power utilization, there's certain things that are going to be relevant across both training and inference that they could probably take lessons from what they've learned in solving these training problems and apply them to inference as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. In my last conversation with you, Will, I remember you're talking about kind of valuable data, right? There's a lot of data that's not valuable. You're driving and it's like down the street, you can't do anything with it. But then there's valuable data. It's like these corner cases that like don't pop up, but if you have them, you could be much safer in these really unique cases. And I think when I look at Dojo, one of the things is it's like they're doing this massively ambitious project for training, and they would only do that if they really needed that type of compute power. You know what I'm saying? Like, and the only way they could need that type of compute power if they're massively taking advantage of some huge amounts of data and valuable data. So it just seems to me like it's like a massively bullish sign that Tesla is investing so much into their own, supercomputer training, cluster, because why would they do that if they didn't have the goods, the data, It's like, curious if you had any follow-up thoughts on kind of that concept. And
Yeah, no, it's perfectly accurate. It's the more data that you have, the more compute horsepower you need. And as their fleet gets larger, it'll generate more data, which will require more compute horsepower. So you sort of have this feedback loop of more data, more compute equals more customers, or equals better model, equals more customers, equals more data, equals more compute requirements, and so forth. So I think they'll continue to evolve the sort of Dojo stack, in the future to continue to meet sort of the capacity needs for training.
Yeah. I was glancing at some of the recent papers. I think Microsoft did one, but like how they're noticing with larger neural nets, you're able to get higher performance. And, even compared to a few years ago, they didn't expect like you could scale these neural nets so big and that the performance would actually, be better. But then it brings up this other thing is it needs so much more compute power than we have right now. Do you think that's part of the play that Andre and Elon are doing? They're saying we need to scale our neural nets and the data, everything's so massively big and fast. We need the compute power. That's going to be a limiting factor. It's going to be one of the bottlenecks, and we have to invest heavily. Is that part of you think they're thinking?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you go back 5 years, most people in AI anticipated that the sort of value of data would start to asymptote in many cases. And so with OpenAI, with GPT-2, the team at OpenAI expected like, okay, if we throw more data at this, it'll get marginally better, but the improvements won't be linear. Turns out that's not true. The more data you throw at a model, the better it gets. And it seems in many cases, like with GPT-3, it hasn't found its asymptote yet. And so that's great in that we can build better models just by throwing more data, but that's also challenging in that we need more compute horsepower. And I think that there are two ways to sort of solve that problem. The first is by just literally building more compute horsepower, building better hardware. And the second is software improvements to sort of training into neural nets. And we've seen OpenAI published a paper recently that showed that the cost of training an AI model has decreased at about 68% a year, based just purely on software improvements. And so this is optimized training techniques. It's all sorts of techniques and tricks that are being employed to make neural nets and training neural nets more efficient. And so I think we have this sort of compounding effect where neural nets and training neural nets is fundamentally getting more efficient from a software perspective, while compute capacity continues to increase. And so if you compound that over a number of years, like the horizon's promising. But yeah, certainly, if unless that asymptote's reached in cases soon, I think that compute horsepower requirements are going to continue to increase.
Yeah, I think another driver, of the data size growth is not just the number of cars that Tesla's selling and how many miles they're driving them, but now that they're talking about using simulation as well, there's simulated miles that get added on top of that they can, permute a certain scenario and number of times that just vastly increases the number of training cycles they need to run beyond just what was recorded, because they're now simulating as well.
What I want to dive into the simulation. So that was one of the things I was like, whoa, I didn't expect Tesla to show so much, of what they're doing with simulation. In the context of like, Will, your point of where does the data asymptote? Like that was one of my big takeaways with my conversation last time with you was you're like, hey, it's hard to get valuable data, but it's also the type of data where, it doesn't asymptote, like it keeps value even, as you continue to accumulate it. And with driving, like, so I actually have the beta FSD in my car for the past month or so. And as I'm driving, I'm like, there are just these weird cases that like pop up all the time. I'm like, so surprised at how many just strange cases pop up like every day and practically. And I'm like, how in the world can you plan for this? How in the world can you think of it? And how can other competitors gather this much of these crazy weird cases without a huge fleet? My question is like, does simulation, can it get so good that maybe it, reduces some of that advantage that Tesla has? Like can, competitors somehow leverage the incremental, the growing, simulation advantages or just value, or do you think the real life crazy edge case, images are going to keep their, high value, indefinitely, you think?
Yeah. What we've heard from Tesla is that real world data is better than simulation. And simulation is great for cases where you either, don't have that data in the real world, or it's very hard to collect and label that data. And so, for example, car accidents, if you want to simulate car accidents of a semi blowing up next to you, like, maybe there's one case of that happening in Tesla's sort of real world data set. Hopefully not, but that's something you can simulate very easily. And so, I think it's useful. It's better than no data, but it's not as good as real world data. And, we heard that from Tesla. At ARK, we've also heard that from other players in the space, where they say, hey, simulated data is great for certain things, but real world data is better. And I don't see that trend flipping in the near term. But I think simulation does benefit certain situations.
Do you think like they can take these crazy, like unique edge cases and then use simulation to reproduce those edge cases across a lot of scenarios to basically bolster performance in more edge cases like that? I mean, basically, can they use both? And that can that be like an advantage, that is even more difficult to overcome?
Yeah, I would imagine so. I would imagine there's ways to sort of integrate real world edge case captures where maybe you only have, 2 samples and sort of rerun that in the simulation, where you can generate 1,000 samples. And that's sufficient to sort of train the fleet on how to handle that edge case. So I could certainly see that playing out. It's like what we talked about before, the piano in the road. Like I say that as a joke, but I'm sure there has been a piano on a road somewhere. But it's super rare. And so maybe in the real world, it happens once and it's captured and labeled. And then, perhaps they could rerun that in a simulation, 100 times over, from different perspectives.
definitely.
Yeah, I think the real world models are needed to figure out what the unknowns are. And then once you know the unknowns, you can simulate them 1,000 times to get really good at handling them. And then you still need that real world data to get that broader view that you can then train more with the simulation.
Yeah, definitely. I know you guys, I think, have been talking about this problem of the last foot delivery as well. Kind of like, okay, so let's say you have autonomous vehicles, they can get to some place, but the last foot from the car to the porch, is it even economical or feasible to do like a robot, or do you just do drone delivery? Is it just better to go by air? What are your current thoughts right now? Do you think actually like this Tesla bot is a feasible alternative to drones, where either the Tesla bot, goes together with the robo van or something to deliver food or groceries or something, or it could ride an electric scooter or something in itself? Or do you think drones are the way that most packages and food will be delivered?
Yeah. So one of our other analysts, Tasha, does a lot of work in the space. So she'd be interested to hear her take on this. I think my perspective is, at least in the near to medium term, I think drones would make more sense, as a sort of last mile delivery mechanism. If you think about it, you have fewer sort of objects to overcome in the air than you do on the ground. There's a reason that planes have operated with autopilots for many, many years, because it's fundamentally less complicated to go between point A and point B at 5,000 feet, or for drones, 500 feet, than it is to go, 5,000 feet on a city road. So I think from that perspective, it's easier. And I also think from a actual, delivery perspective, if you think about the logistics of, how many different ways there are to get from a curbside to somebody's door. Some people have ramps, some people have stairs, some people have, hills to climb. Like there's so many sort of edge cases to get from a curb to a door. You could solve that if you had sufficient data, I'm sure. But it seems like in the near to medium term, given that it's kind of a cold start problem, it seems like drones would make more sense.
Got it. Yeah, I'm wondering by kind of this past Tesla AI Day and the ambition that Tesla showed during that day, does that give you guys any more confidence on Tesla's FSD plans, that they can actually execute them, eventually at some time? And also another idea is, does it give you some ideas of like, are there any other like business lines or products or areas that they can go into? So we have, with kind of AI and hardware, so we have the cars, we have these robots, but are there any other kind of mysterious things that maybe people haven't thought about? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'll speak from my perspective. I didn't read too much into signaling around, hey, we're moving on to this new problem, so this one's solved. I know some people did. My take on it was more looking at the actual technology under the hood and looking at the advancements that have been made. The stated objective is we want to have an autonomous fleet of robotaxis, and we very thoroughly understand the sort of financial implications of that if it's successful. And so I was most interested in trying to understand how far along they are in that objective and hitting the goalpost there. And I think that my conviction increased based on what we saw during Autonomy Day. Like just looking at the sort of the move to vector space for me was the biggest thing, and looking at all the technical challenges they had to overcome and that they did overcome successfully in order to get there. I think for me was a positive indicator, and that yes, I think that they are closer to FSD than before, and also that they have the ability as an organization to overcome these really, really hard technical challenges. And it sort of echoes back to the Apollo program. The Apollo program was just a relentless sort of list of unsolvable technical problems that teams of really smart, dedicated, creative people who are hell-bent on solving a mission were able to overcome. And I think FSD is similar in the sense that you can throw out a million reasons why it's really hard, but they've overcome all of those reasons so far. And I think that gives me confidence in their ability to overcome the additional challenges and problems that they're going to face to getting to a point where they can roll out, an autonomous taxi network.
Awesome. Frank, I want to get your thoughts on crypto a bit. I know that I've talked with Yassine in depth, regarding Bitcoin. What's kind of your angle on crypto? What's your kind of motivation, driving kind of passion to analyze, and what makes you bullish about crypto in general?
Yeah, so Yassine's been covering crypto at ARK for 4+ years now. I joined much more recently, but we've been interested in the digital asset space in general for a long time, and we've really started by looking at Bitcoin as a foundational asset that the larger crypto economy is built around. And me personally, I've been one thing, I've been a long time Ethereum miner since the 2017 bull run, and that was kind of like my tiptoe into the crypto world. Of seeing this new emergent technology that I, as an individual, could play a part of. I can help process transactions and actually get rewarded for supporting this network. And that's what made me excited about it. What makes me and ARK excited about the Ethereum space, or really crypto beyond Bitcoin now, are the economies we're seeing start to be built on top of these layer one blockchains. So when you look at Ethereum, back in 2017 and 2018, the main functionality that it was serving was ICOs. You could create your own digital asset as a means of crowdsourcing fundraising, and you could have some proposed roadmap and economics that token would play, whether it was ownership or governance or some form of utility. But what you saw was that was all great. People had a lot of ideas. There was a lot of funding, but it was very poor follow through and execution. What you see now are actual decentralized applications being built that have users and have volume and have liquidity. Whereas I was looking at decentralized apps in 2018 that had 400 or 500 daily active users. We're now in the hundreds of thousands for a lot of these apps. So the scale is a lot bigger. Uniswap is doing billions of volume daily. OpenSea just hit $1 billion of volume in the month of August, which is more than it's done in the entire history combined. Which is pretty crazy. So seeing these kind of, whether it's DeFi or NFTs or any other, Web3 things, seeing all these economies and products being built on crypto is what makes us excited and generally bullish.
Yeah. I don't know if it's like, if you guys have picked up on it, but I just feel like there's like this momentum. Like, I don't know if it's a momentum shift with Ethereum and some of these decentralized apps and some of these games as well, that like are having real economy. Like it's amazing that the usage, like Axie Infinity and some others, like where I'm like, wow, this wasn't happening like a year or two ago. It's taken up another level. You had kind of the DeFi summer, and then there's something else going on right now. It's like this expansion, and it's fascinating to me because of a few things. One is like it gives people property rights that they can hold on to, and potentially can't be taken away, but they're tradable property rights too, without going through governments and restrictions, bureaucracies. And in the case of like Afghanistan, which like is this crisis right now, and I've been trying to like help people and coordinating some money transfer to help people, get out. And the biggest problem is getting things to the right people, and like with cash, and through borders and through people, and people have a hard time helping because we can't get cash through, and it seems like in a alternative universe where you have, property rights digitally secured on a blockchain, transferable, bypassing, restrictions, etc. It seems like a whole new world of freedom, of economic opportunity, of economic activity starts to open up. And it seems like we're starting to see like this opening with the Ethereum blockchain as a foundation, with a lot of things happening currently. Like, I mean, what's your take? I mean, are you seeing, some things like that, or what's up?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, an analogous scenario to what you just mentioned is early stage venture funding in a lot of these crypto startups that need funding immediately, and they have globally distributed teams and no accounting setup. It's run on a Discord server maybe. And the funding mechanism is not US dollars that have to go to a bank account that may or may not exist yet. It's USDC that can go straight to an Ethereum wallet. And I've heard many examples of that. It's a means of transferring capital and transferring value that is just built for the internet. It's way faster than what you can do today with traditional rails. And I think it's very easy to take for granted that aspect of it if you live in the US and you have a bank account and a paycheck that goes straight to your bank account, and you can easily Venmo, and everything is basically easy already. You don't see those pain points or those opportunities unless you look at a broader international context and some of these places where you don't have those safeguards, or the government is not even beneficial. It's actually adversarial against you in seizure of wealth. And that's where I think crypto really shines.
Yeah. I mean, one other thing is like people are barred from typical angel investing without being an accredited investor, without knowing the connections. And it's like this whole world of private, equity is like all like, it's like this, I don't know what you call it, but it's like you need to have all of the connections, all this stuff to get into the best companies. But it seems like crypto has turned it upside down, where it's like it's like a meritocracy in angel investing, where it's like if you know the information, if you are in the cutting edge, if you are the player in the right game and you believe in the right thing, you can actually put in that amount of money to get an outsized return that wasn't possible, or it was restricted from most general people in the public. And of course, on the downside, you're going to have a lot of failed experiments, a lot of failed money, etc. But it opens the playing field. And it's a completely different, I think, mindset. And there's always the critics who say, oh, it's all vaporware, etc. But it seems like we're getting on the Ethereum blockchain, like we're getting some possibilities of some long-term, platforms or winners being built on this. That if you have a equity on this or piece of the pie, it's a unique, a different paradigm, it seems, of opportunity and investing. Any thoughts on that?
I think, just from an investor accreditation standpoint, I think it's ridiculous to say that, somebody is qualified because they have $1 million or $1.1 million, whereas somebody who has $800,000 isn't qualified. It seems like a crazy threshold. And, we've seen, with our community of retail investors, they're incredibly well informed about, issues that they care about. And, there are people who are investing in cryptocurrency or, name any other company, public company, who know more about that company than most people who are professionals in the world of finance, right? There are people who we've talked to, who we've engaged with in our community, who know more about Tesla or, Palantir than the analysts on sell side companies that are actually covering those organizations. And so it's pretty incredible to see the power of retail investors. And I think, like you said, this seems to be a mechanism for them to participate earlier in a company's life cycle without, sort of this crazy requirement of being accredited or qualified with, $1 million for no apparent reason.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask you about Palantir. So I know ARK, you guys have been, buying some Palantir, and since our last conversation, Will, have you kind of had some more thoughts on Palantir? Have you been able to, I don't know, evolve some thinking? And where do you currently stand on, for example, their AI expertise, their defensible, let's say, moat or advantage, and their projections to grow revenue, let's say even 50% or more per year for the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a couple trends that I think are interesting with Palantir. They got a tailwind from COVID with government contracts. And I think as we started to exit COVID, and I guess you could argue now start to re-enter COVID to a degree, that tailwind hasn't slowed down in the sense that while maybe their core contracts related to COVID are running up, we see government agencies, both federal, state, across the world, reintroducing Palantir to solve other problems within their agency. And so I think for government side of Palantir, I think COVID was actually a great beachhead into many organizations and agencies across the world that they wouldn't have worked with otherwise, or would have worked with much later in their life cycle. And so I think there's a strong tailwind of sort of government adoption in that sense. And I think from an enterprise perspective, they gave an example in their last earnings call where Boeing actually switched to a joint venture software platform of Palantir and Airbus away from something that they home grew with Microsoft. I think that's a great sort of indication as to what's happening across the board with enterprises when it comes to Palantir. Often they're competing with a homegrown solution. In many cases, it's Palantir versus, hey, let's build this platform ourselves. And there are certain advantages to doing both, but it seems like the choice is tipping towards Palantir in many cases, and we think that's going to continue. Also interesting is the sort of move down market in the activity with SPAC investments, and their thesis around this is, hey, we're going to invest in a company early in its life cycle, get them to build their company on top of our platform, and then we'll grow with them. And I think this sort of organic story of, hey, we're going to be the platform that helps a company build their first product or build a series of products and then grow with that company is really interesting. We saw that with Twilio. For a long time, that's what drove Twilio's growth, is these, companies like Uber, who use them very early on to actually build their technology, to build their product. And then, Twilio benefited in that they grew with Uber. To me, Palantir is interesting in that that's sort of a new customer demographic where I think there's a lot of greenfield opportunity. You have the government sector, which we just talked about, that has that kind of tailwind continuing. And then you also have the traditional enterprise. Palantir started in the commercial side with big enterprises, right? Selling $10 million contracts to, giant companies. And I think that's continuing. And I think companies are acquiring more data than ever. They need to start to layer AI on top of all of their, their processes in order to stay competitive. And I think Palantir is sort of in an advantaged position to help those companies through that transition. So overall, yeah, I think it's an interesting story. Given all of that and given sort of the head start that they had many, many years ago with the government, I think it'll be an interesting story over the next 5 or 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely agree. I want to give you guys kind of, as we wrap up, kind of an opportunity just to we circle back to Tesla AI Day. Any kind of other thoughts you guys have, just like random off the wall, just, ideas or opinions?
I'll share one. I think the bottleneck in AI right now is talent. And, there are many companies who want to build AI, products or infuse AI into their products. And the challenge right now for many of those companies is recruiting engineers, right? It's recruiting data scientists. And I think we saw that with Tesla. Like, the stated purpose of this was to recruit people. I think that's going to be sort of an interesting dynamic, and that those people are like professional athletes, right? They're top tier professional athletes, and they can choose where they go. And I think we're starting to see more of those top tier engineers and data scientists shift towards the Teslas of the world and away from, the legacy companies or the research institutions where they've been working previously. So I think that's an interesting trend. And I think that's also going to make it harder for other companies to compete, right? We talked about this a little bit last time. If you're an old world auto manufacturer, right, the chances that you're going to recruit a top tier data scientist out of the PhD program at Stanford are relatively low. Like, that person's probably going to go to Google or go to Tesla. And Tesla and Google have the capital to pay those people, right? They can pay $1 million, $1.5 million salaries. I think that's really what the market's demanding. And so the sort of talent problem is going to benefit those companies who are in an advantaged position right now. And it's going to hurt the companies that are old that nobody wants to work at. So I think that's sort of an interesting dynamic that's playing out currently.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. How about you, Frank?
I would say, kind of along the same lines, but one of the things that stands out to me is just that AI Day exists. Like, Tesla has this 3-hour-long event and kind of pulls back the curtain on these are the biggest problems that we're facing and how we've solved and are trying to solve them. Come do it with us. And it kind of almost reminds me of ARK's approach to investing, where we try and make all of our research open source and really bring people along and get them to buy into what we believe about the world. And I think Tesla, they're not opening sourcing any of their models or anything, but they're trying to do the same thing of showing what they're doing, showing what they believe in, showing kind of how they're tackling it, and getting people to hop on board. And I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Just to show, even the structure, the diagrams, like how they're approaching problems, is sharing insights. I think actually, I think Elon a little bit maybe misunderstood. I don't want to say misunderstood, but there was miscommunication with the open source question at AI Day. I think, like, for example, Elon obviously is like saying we can't open source the whole project, like how is we're going to pay for it. But there could be maybe some opportunity to open source different parts or tools or something, right? I think perhaps Elon would be open to that. And it's a tricky subject because even though Tesla has built a lot of stuff, they've built it on top of actually open source tools because,
Yep.
like you need open source tools. You can't build stuff without the building of others, right? Everything is built on like everything else, it feels like. And so in that sense, I think they seem to be doing some in terms of laying out, their technologies and what they're solving for. And we'll see if they do some more, more limited open source stuff too, though. Yeah. I want to thank you guys. I appreciate your guys' openness always. ARK Invest, just their ethos to share, to engage in the community. Some of my favorite chats with you guys, and getting into the weeds of all this stuff. But I'm going to go ahead and link to Will, your Twitter account, and to Frank, yours in the video description, so you guys can follow. Anywhere else that people can maybe read some interesting stuff that you guys has put out, or any articles, reports, etc. Maybe that you're passionate about.
Yeah, I'd say check out our website. We put all of our marketing material up there, and you can go down and read the reports, read the blogs. But Twitter is a great source too. All the analysts are on Twitter. Kathy's on Twitter. Our director of research is on Twitter, and we're pretty active with Twitter. So feel free to check out the tweets, engage with us, ask us questions. That's why we're there.
Awesome. All right. Thanks a lot again. And we'll see everyone else in our next show. Thanks.
Sounds good. Thank you.